My name is Frank Tierney. I'm 58 years old now, but this started back when I was 46. For most of my life, I've been a heavy equipment mechanic, specializing in agricultural machinery. Combines, tractors, planters. If it works a field in the Midwest, I've probably had my hands in its guts at some point. I live in central Indiana, in that endless flat checkerboard of corn and soybeans that people fly over on their way to somewhere important. It's a quiet life, always has been. I'm not the kind of guy who goes looking for trouble, and I was never one for ghost stories or tall tales. I believed in what I could see, touch, and fix with a wrench. What I'm about to tell you, it doesn't fit into that world. I know how it's going to sound. I've played it over in my own head 1,000 times, and it still sounds like something ripped from a cheap paperback novel. But it happened. And living with it is one thing, but living with it alone is another. So I'm telling it for my own sanity, maybe. Or maybe as a warning. Before I get into what happened, if you're new here, consider subscribing. I share stories like this regularly. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I always like to know who's listening. All right, let me tell you what happened, starting with that first night. It was late August, the air so thick and wet you could drink it. The kind of heat that clings to you long after the sun goes down. Harvest was coming on, and that's my busy season. Farmers are pushing their machines hard, and things break. I got a call around 4 in the afternoon from a fellow named Miller, an old-timer with a couple hundred acres of corn out past the county line. His combine had thrown a hydraulic line, and he was in a panic, seeing the storm clouds that were forecast for the weekend. I told him I'd get out there as soon as I could. I finished up the job I was on, loaded a few extra hoses and fittings into my service truck, and headed out. It was already getting on towards 6 o'clock by the time I turned off the state highway onto the gravel roads that snake through the farmland. Miller's place was isolated, even for around here. It was a good 5 miles of gravel, with the corn growing so high on either side, it felt like you were driving through a tunnel. His was the last farm on the road before it dead-ended at the river. I'd been to his place a few times over the years. It was an old homestead, the house and barn showing their age, paint peeling and roofs sagging a little. He usually had a couple of blue heeler dogs that would raise hell the second my truck tires hit the driveway, barking and chasing my bumpers until I came to a stop. That night, though, there was nothing. Just the sound of my diesel engine idling, and the crunch of gravel as I pulled up next to the big machine shed. The combine was sitting out in the open, right at the edge of the field, its massive header looking like the jaw of some dead metal insect. I cut the engine, and the silence that rolled in was thick, total. I remember thinking it was strange about the dogs. I figured Miller must have put them inside. I grabbed my toolbox and my big mag light, even though there was still a good hour of daylight left. The sun was hanging low and orange, casting long, distorted shadows from the silos and the corn stalks. I saw a note taped to the shed door. It was from Miller. Said he had to run into town to pick up his wife. Key was in the combine, just to leave the bill on the kitchen table when I was done. That was fine by me. I preferred working alone anyway, less distraction. So I climbed up into the combine's engine bay, found the burst hose. It was a nasty split, right at the crimped fitting, and got to work. The air was still and heavy, full of the smell of cut hay, diesel, and the sweet, dusty scent of ripening corn. It was a smell I'd known my whole life, a comforting smell. But not that night. That night, something felt off. As I was working, wrestling with the greasy hose in the cramped engine compartment, I started to notice the quiet more. It wasn't just the absence of the dogs barking. It was everything. Usually at that time of evening, the air would be buzzing with the sound of cicadas, a high electric drone That's the constant soundtrack to an Indiana summer. There was none of that. No crickets chirping, no birds calling from the woodlot behind the barn. The silence was so complete that the clank of my wrench against a bolt sounded like a gunshot. It made me self-conscious, like I was making too much noise, intruding on something. I stopped for a minute, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of a greasy hand, and just listened. Nothing. The cornfield, a wall of green and gold stretching as far as I could see, was perfectly still. Not a single leaf rustled. The air was dead calm. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. I've been alone on farms in the middle of nowhere hundreds of times. It never bothered me. But this was different. I felt watched. It was a primal feeling, the kind of thing you can't reason away. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I told myself I was being stupid, just tired from a long day. Maybe a big storm was rolling in, and the animals were taking cover. I tried to focus on my work, on the familiar feel of the tools in my hands, the logic of hydraulics and mechanics. I got the old hose off and started fitting the new one. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, and the world was painted in shades of gray and deep purple. I had my maglite on, its beam cutting a clean white circle in the growing darkness. That's when I heard it. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a heavy, deliberate sound from the edge of the cornfield, maybe 50 yards from where I was working. It was the sound of something massive shifting its weight. It wasn't the crack of a breaking twig like a deer would make. This was a solid, muffled thump, and the rustle of dozens of cornstalks moving at once. My first thought was a cow. Maybe one of Miller's had gotten out of its pasture and wandered into the corn. I'd seen that before. But Miller raised hogs, not cattle. My next thought, a bit more unnerving, was a bear. It was unlikely. We don't really have a black bear population in this part of the state, but every few years you hear a story about one wandering down from Michigan. A bear would explain the silence. The other animals would have gone quiet, steering clear of a major predator. I stayed still, listening. For a long minute, there was nothing but that oppressive silence again. Then I heard it again, closer this time. The same sound, a heavy shifting, a rustle of leaves. Whatever it was moving along the edge of the field, parallel to the driveway. My brain was still trying to find a logical box to put this in. A person? Maybe Miller had come back and was trying to spook me? It didn't seem like his style. He was a pretty straight-laced old guy. I called out, my voice sounding tight and unfamiliar. "Hello? Mr. Miller? Is that you?" The only answer was the echo of my own voice, seeming to get swallowed up by the corn. And then, silence again. The thing, whatever it was, had stopped moving. It knew I was there. It knew I knew it was there. My heart was starting to hammer against my ribs. I slowly, carefully, climbed down from the combine. I left my tools where they were. My only thought was to get to the cab of my truck, where I could lock the doors and be surrounded by steel and glass. I kept the maglite in my hand, sweeping its beam across the first few rows of corn. The light just seemed to get eaten by the density of the stalks. I couldn't see more than 10 feet in. And then I saw them, 2 points of light reflecting my beam. Eyes. They were low to the ground, maybe 2 feet up, and they were spaced wide apart. Way too wide for a coyote or a dog, wider than a deer's. They just stared back at me, unblinking. They glowed with a faint, yellowish-green light. I kept the beam fixed on them, my hand slick with a mixture of grease and sweat. I took a half-step back towards my truck. The eyes moved. They didn't just blink or turn away. They rose. They went from being 2 feet off the ground to being 7 feet off the ground in a smooth, fluid motion, that made no sense. It was like watching something unfold itself. My mind just stopped working for a second. I was trying to process what I was seeing, and my brain just couldn't do it. It wasn't a bear standing up. A bear is bulky, clumsy on two legs. This was graceful and tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen. It took one deliberate step out of the corn and into the dim twilight. And my world, the one I knew with the wrenches and the diesel engines and the predictable seasons, it just cracked right down the middle. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a suit. It was something else entirely. It stood on two legs that were bent like a dog's, with reversed knees. It was covered in coarse, dark fur, patchy in places, like it had mange. Its arms were too long for its body, ending in what I can only describe as hands, but they were wrong, with thick, dark claws curving from the fingertips. But the face, that was the worst part. It had a long, lupine snout, filled with yellowed teeth that I could see even from that distance. But the eyes were not the eyes of an animal. They were intelligent. They were aware. And they were looking right at me, not with mindless aggression, but with a calm, calculating appraisal. It was sizing me up. I was frozen. It felt like my boots were nailed to the ground. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, holding the flashlight on this thing. Time seemed to stretch out, to get thick and syrupy. I took in details that I wish I could forget. The way its chest rose and fell with deep, silent breaths. The muscles that shifted and bunched under its skin. The way its head tilted slightly, as if it were curious. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, a towering, impossible silhouette against the dark wall of corn. It took another step, and this one was not towards me. It moved towards the big machine shed, its gait a weird, loping stride that was utterly silent. It reached the shed door, a big, heavy, sliding door on a metal track, and it did something that shattered the last bit of my denial. It reached out one of its clawed hands, curled its long fingers around the handle, and gave it a pull. Not a frantic, animalistic scratch, but a deliberate, methodical test, like a person checking if a door is locked. The door rattled on its track, but held firm. The creature seemed to consider this for a moment. Then it turned its head and looked back at me. In that moment, I knew two things with absolute certainty. One, this was not a beast acting on instinct. It was thinking. It was problem-solving. And two, I was going to die here, next to a broken combine, on a farm in the middle of nowhere. That realization, the certainty of my own death, is what finally broke the paralysis. It was like a switch flipped in my brain. I wasn't thinking anymore, just moving. I started backing away, slowly at first, trying not to make any sudden movements that might trigger a chase. I never took my eyes off it, never let the beam of the maglite waver. It watched me go, its head following my retreat, those intelligent yellow-green eyes tracking my every step. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. My breath was coming in ragged, shallow gasps. My service truck was maybe 40 feet away, but it felt like miles. Every step was an agony of suspense. I was waiting for it to rush me, to close the distance in a couple of those long, loping strides. But it didn't. It just stood there and watched. It let me get to the truck. My hand, shaking violently, fumbled for the door handle. The click of the latch opening was deafening. I threw myself inside, slamming the heavy door shut behind me. I didn't bother with the seat belt. My hands were trembling so badly, it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. I could see the creature through the windshield, still standing by the shed, a dark, monstrous shape illuminated in the glow of my interior lights. Please start, please start, Please start, I chanted in my head, a frantic prayer to the god of internal combustion engines. I turned the key. The old diesel engine groaned, turned over once, twice, and then roared to life. The headlights flashed on, pinning the creature in their full glare. For the first time, it reacted. It didn't flinch or snarl, but it raised one of its long arms to shield its eyes, a gesture so unnervingly human it made me feel sick. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I slammed the truck into reverse, stomped on the accelerator, and spun the wheel. The tires screamed on the gravel, kicking up a cloud of dust and stones. I didn't care about Miller's lawn or anything else. I just needed to be gone. I straightened out and floored it, fishtailing down the long driveway back towards the road. I risked a glance in my rearview mirror. The cloud of dust was settling in my headlights, and it was just standing there, at the edge of the light's reach, watching me leave. It wasn't chasing, it wasn't running, it was just observing. And somehow, that was more terrifying than a mindless pursuit. It was like it had allowed me to leave. Like I was a mouse it had decided not to play with anymore. The drive back to the main road was a blur. I ran every stop sign, took the curves on the gravel roads way too fast. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and I couldn't stop shaking. The adrenaline was coursing through me, making me feel cold and hot at the same time. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that tall, dark shape loping along behind me, effortlessly keeping pace with the truck. But there was nothing. Just darkness and the twin ribbons of road illuminated by my headlights. When I finally hit the paved state highway, I felt a wave of relief so intense it almost made me pass out. I pulled over to the shoulder, killed the engine, and just sat there in the dark, my whole body trembling. I leaned my head against the steering wheel and tried to breathe. What did I just see? My mind was racing, trying to find a rational explanation, any explanation, other than the impossible truth. A trick of the light? A hallucination brought on by fatigue and heat? It was no good. I knew what I saw. The reversed knees, the intelligent eyes, the hand on the door handle. You don't hallucinate details like that. You don't imagine something so completely outside your frame of reference. I finally got myself under control enough to drive home. When I walked into the house, my wife Martha was in the kitchen. She took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. I was pale, covered in a cold sweat, my clothes stained with grease and dirt. She asked me what happened. I couldn't tell her. How could I? I just mumbled something about a difficult job, about nearly getting crushed by a piece of equipment. It was a weak lie, and I think she knew it, but she didn't press. I went and stood in the shower for a long time, letting the hot water run over me, as if I could wash the memory away. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, those yellow eyes. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside the window, sent a jolt of fear through me. The world I had lived in for 46 years, a world of cause and effect, of physics and mechanics, had been violated. There was something out there, living in the shadows between the cornfields, that didn't play by the rules I understood. The next morning, I called Miller. I told him I'd run into a problem and had to order a part, that it would be a few days before I could get back out to finish the job. It was another lie. I couldn't go back there. I never wanted to set foot on that farm again. I ended up sending one of my younger employees out to finish the repair a couple of days later. He didn't mention anything unusual, said the dogs were out and barking like always. I never told a soul what I saw. Who would believe me? In a small, practical community like ours, a story like that would get you labeled as a drunk or a lunatic. It was better to keep it to myself, to lock it away. Over the next few years, I tried to forget it. I mostly succeeded. Life went on. My son Daniel grew up. I worked. The seasons turned. The memory faded, becoming less like a real event and more like a nightmare I'd once had. I convinced myself that maybe my mind had played tricks on me. I avoided that part of the county, taking the long way around on jobs if I had to. It became a piece of my own private, crazy history, a story I would take to my grave. I was wrong. It wasn't over. It was just waiting. 10 years passed, a whole decade. I was 56. Daniel was 16, a good kid, tall and quiet like his mother. He'd started helping me out on weekends and during the summer. We had our own place by then, a small 40-acre property with an old farmhouse we'd fixed up. It was our little slice of peace and quiet, surrounded on 3 sides by a neighbor's cornfields and backing up to a dense patch of woods. I'd installed motion sensor floodlights around the house and barn, telling myself it was for security against thieves. But a small part of me knew the real reason. I felt safer in a pool of bright, artificial light. The memory of that night at Miller's farm was a distant thing, a scar that had long since faded. I'd almost managed to convince myself it had never really happened. That changed on a Saturday in late October. The air was crisp and cool, smelling of wood smoke and decaying leaves. The corn in the surrounding fields had been harvested, leaving behind acres of dry, broken stubble. It was a perfect autumn afternoon. Daniel and I were out at the far edge of our property, replacing a section of fence that bordered the woods. Our dog Buster, a tough-as-nails blue heeler mix, who was afraid of nothing, was with us, sniffing around the fence line. We were working, talking about school, about the truck Daniel was hoping to buy. It was normal. And then, just like that, it wasn't. The first sign was the silence. It fell over the fields like a heavy blanket. The birds in the woods went quiet. The squirrels stopped chattering. Even the wind seemed to die down. It was the same unnatural, profound quiet from that night 10 years ago. A cold dread, icy and familiar, washed over me. I straightened up from the fence post I was setting and scanned the line of trees, then the empty, harvested cornfield. I saw nothing, but I could feel it, that same feeling of being watched by something old and patient. Buster felt it too. He stopped sniffing, his body went rigid, and the fur on his back stood up. A low, guttural whine started deep in his chest. He backed up against my legs, trembling. He'd treed raccoons and chased off coyotes without a second thought. But this was different. This was terror. I put my hand on Daniel's shoulder. My voice was low, urgent. "Danny, we're going back to the house, right now. Leave the tools." He looked at me, confused. "Dad, what's wrong?" "Just move," I said, my voice harder than I intended. "Go." He saw the look on my face and didn't argue. He started walking, and I followed right behind him, with Buster practically glued to my ankle. We hadn't gone 20 feet when they stepped out. They didn't emerge from the woods. They came from the corn stubble, rising up from a shallow ditch I hadn't even noticed. There were 2 of them. They were bigger than the one I'd seen before, their bodies more filled out, more powerful. One was the same dark, mangy color I remembered, but the other was a grizzled gray, its fur shot through with silver. They stood on those same impossible dog-like legs, their long arms hanging at their sides. The memory came rushing back not as a distant nightmare, but as a present, visceral reality. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a random encounter. This wasn't a territorial display. The way they moved, the way they positioned themselves, it was a hunt. They began to spread out, flanking us, their movements fluid and silent. They were cutting off our path back to the house. The gray one lowered its head and let out a sound that vibrated in my chest. It wasn't a howl or a growl. It was a low, resonant series of clicks and guttural noises, a form of communication. It was talking to the other one. My mind was screaming. Daniel was frozen beside me, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. The protective instinct I felt in that moment was the most powerful thing I have ever experienced. It burned away my own fear. I shoved him hard. "Run!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "Run for the house, Daniel. Don't stop and don't look back. Go!" For a second he hesitated, looking from me to the creatures. Then he turned and ran. He was a track athlete in school, and he was fast. I turned to face them, grabbing the heaviest thing I could find, a steel post driver that weighed a good 30 pounds. It felt like a toothpick in my hands. I held it up like a club, planting my feet. "Get away from him!" I screamed, a useless, pathetic gesture of defiance. The dark one took a step toward me, but the gray one made that clicking sound again, and it stopped. It wasn't interested in me. They both turned their heads and watched Daniel run. Then, in perfect unison, they dropped to all fours. The transformation was sickeningly fast, their bodies elongated, their posture shifting from bipedal to quadrupedal in a single, fluid motion. They were no longer awkward, loping giants. They were lean, powerful running machines, bigger than any wolf I could imagine. And they were fast. They took off after my son, their powerful legs eating up the ground, kicking up clods of dirt and corn stubble. I ran too. I'm not a young man anymore, and I knew I couldn't keep up. But I ran with everything I had, screaming his name, hoping to draw their attention. They ignored me completely. Their focus was entirely on the smaller, faster prey ahead of them. I watched in horror as they closed the distance. Daniel was running flat out, but they were gaining on him with terrifying speed. The 100 yards to the relative safety of our yard felt like an impossible distance. I could hear their breathing now, a harsh, panting sound. I could hear the rhythmic thud of their paws hitting the hard autumn earth. I was sure I was about to watch my son die. I was preparing myself for the sight of them pulling him down. But Daniel had a good head start, and he was running on pure terror. He burst out of the stubble field and onto the mowed grass of our backyard, just as the motion sensors kicked on. The world was suddenly flooded with the stark white light of the floodlights. The two creatures hesitated for a single, crucial second at the edge of the light, momentarily blinded. That second was all Daniel needed. He scrambled up the 3 steps to the back porch and threw himself against the door, screaming for his mother. I was only a few yards behind him. I saw the back door swing open and Martha's terrified face appear. She grabbed Daniel, pulling him inside. I launched myself up the steps, turned, and slammed the heavy oak door shut, just as a massive, dark body crashed against it with enough force to splinter the wood around the lock. I threw the deadbolt home, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the knob. The impact threw me back against the kitchen counter. We were inside. We were safe. But it wasn't over. A horrible scraping sound started on the door, the sound of thick claws gouging deep furrows into the wood. Then another impact, harder this time, rattling the dishes in the cupboards. We could hear them outside, circling the house. Buster was barking hysterically, a sound of pure panic and fury. We backed away from the door, deeper into the house. Daniel was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with shock. Martha was trying to calm him, her own face pale with fear, demanding to know what was happening. And then a face appeared in the kitchen window. It was the gray one. It had put its front paws up on the sill and was looking in. Its face was just inches from the glass. In the harsh glare of the floodlight, I could see every detail. The matted silver-streaked fur, the yellow fangs, and the eyes. Those horribly, terribly intelligent, knowing eyes. It looked at me. It met my gaze, and I knew it recognized me. It knew who I was. And there was something in its expression, not rage, not animal hunger, but something that looked chillingly like satisfaction, like it had finally finished a game that had started 10 years ago. That night was the longest of my life. The sounds were a constant torment, the scraping of claws on the siding, the heavy thud of a body testing a wall, the occasional low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all directions at once. At one point, we heard something on the roof, a heavy scratching and scrambling right above our heads. I got my 12-gauge shotgun from the gun safe, loaded it, and sat with my family in the living room, the most central part of the house, away from the windows. I didn't know if buckshot would even slow one of those things down, but holding it made me feel a little less helpless. Daniel eventually cried himself to sleep from sheer exhaustion, curled up on the couch next to his mother. Martha and I just sat there in the dark, listening, waiting for a window to break, for a door to give way. We didn't talk. There was nothing to say. Sometime before dawn, the sounds just stopped. The silence that returned was as sudden and absolute as the silence that had preceded their arrival. We stayed where we were, hardly daring to breathe, until the first gray light of morning crept through the edges of the curtains. I waited until the sun was fully up before I even considered looking outside. I went to the back door first. There were deep, splintering gouges in the wood, some of them nearly half an inch deep. The frame was cracked from the impacts. I walked the perimeter of the house. There were similar claw marks on the siding in a dozen places, especially below the windows. In the soft earth of the flower beds beneath the kitchen window, there were tracks. They were huge, bigger than any canine print I had ever seen, deeper than a bear's. They were wrong. The shape was like a wolf's, but there was an impression at the back of the pad that looked disturbingly like a heel. I called the sheriff's department. A young deputy came out, a kid named Evans. He was polite, took notes, looked at the damage. I told him we were attacked by... I couldn't say it. I just said wild animals. He looked at the tracks. "Wow, Mr. Tierney," he said, shaking his head. "Must have been some big coyotes. Or maybe a cougar. We get reports of them sometimes." He was trying to be helpful, trying to fit it into his world. I knew there was no point in arguing. He took a report, told us to keep our animals inside for a few days, and left. The official explanation was, damage to property by unknown animal. Life didn't go back to normal after that. It couldn't. Daniel had seen them. He knew I wasn't crazy. That shared knowledge was a strange kind of comfort, but also a terrible burden. He had nightmares for months. He wouldn't go outside after dark. He changed, became more withdrawn, more watchful. I felt a crushing weight of guilt. I had brought him out there. I had exposed him to that. We reinforced the doors with steel plates and put security bars on the ground floor windows. The house became a fortress. The peace and quiet of country living was gone forever, replaced by a constant, low-level dread. I still fix farm equipment for a living. I still drive down those long, lonely gravel roads through the cornfields. But now I look at them differently. I don't see fields of crops. I see cover. I see a place where things can hide and watch and wait. I'm telling this story now because Daniel is grown and has a family of his own. He built his house in a subdivision with streetlights and neighbors close on every side. He understands. I think sharing this, putting it out into the world, is my way of letting go of some of the poison I've held inside for so long. People who live in cities don't understand the country. They think it's peaceful. But the quiet out here isn't always peace. Sometimes it's the silence of everything holding its breath because a predator is moving through the shadows. I don't know what I saw. The word werewolf is a word from stories, from movies. What I saw was a real, living thing. A predator that has adapted to live in the margins of our world, in the vast, empty spaces we've left between our towns and highways. The thing that haunts me the most isn't the claws or the teeth. It's the memory of those eyes, the cold, calculating intelligence I saw in them. It wasn't just an animal driven by hunger. It was something that thinks and plans and remembers. And I believe, on that second night, it came back to finish what it started.